watching Let's Chat.
Well, I'm here today with reporter and host of the new true crime podcast, Noble. Let's learn all about it. Thank you for coming on the show, Sean.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me about Noble. What is Noble? What is this podcast?
So it's a brand new 8-episode true crime podcast that comes out on July 31st. And it's about kind of a crazy crime that happened in Northwest Georgia 20 years ago.
Tell us about it, because where does the name Noble come from?
Noble is the name of the town where it took place. It's a sort of unincorporated community outside of Lafayette, not too far from Chattanooga. And they found hundreds of bodies on one rural property.
Wow. What sets this true crime podcast apart?
Well, I think what sets it apart is that it involved just so many people, involved hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people if you count all the families that were affected by it.
So you did your own investigative work in Noble, Georgia with the situation that happened. Is that right?
Yeah, so me and my producer, Johnny Kaufman, went to Noble several times into the area, talked to some of the victims, talked to the investigators, and tried to figure out what happened in 2002.
So what did you learn from your own work all these years later? And is there still things being uncovered?
I'm not sure if there's things being uncovered, but there's very big questions behind it that are still unanswered, I would say. But the podcast digs really, really deep into it. And we discovered so many things, how they investigated the crime, how they identified all these bodies, and then who were the people behind it.
What would you say is the most fascinating thing you've discovered in your work uncovering all of this?
Man, we learned so many interesting things. One thing that we learned that was super interesting was about a team of people called DMORT, Disaster Mortuary Operations Teams, and they are all over the country and all over the world. And when there are these huge events where they have to identify lots of bodies, they fly in kind of like spies with their go bags, and they help identify all these bodies.
So it's 8 episodes. Is that what you said?
Yes, exactly.
And is each one featuring this particular crime, or do you have different crimes on the podcast?
It's just one story about one crime, but it's a massive, massive case. It's one of the biggest cases in the history of the South.
Oh my gosh. So each episode, who are you interviewing? Can you give us a taste of that?
Sure. We're going to be interviewing law enforcement agents, victims, who are the families whose bodies were found on the property, forensic people, legal people, so many different people, and they're all super interesting.
So this happened 22 years ago, but with hundreds of people impacted, you said maybe thousands. Are you still seeing a ripple effect from what these people did and the pain that was caused?
I think a lot of people are still feeling pain today. I think some people have definitely sort of gotten over it and looked past it and found peace, but not everybody.
Now, as a journalist, what has been your what have you liked most about this whole process?
What I've really liked is making it into sort of a positive story, because there's a lot of really dark parts to it, but there's also a lot of people who have found a lot of positives out of it too.
Really? Do you feel like there's closure in this crime?
I think for a lot of people there is, but not for everybody.
Okay. So tell us how we can watch it and maybe what your plans are for the future.
Sure. So the podcast comes out July 31st, the first 2 episodes, and then 1 per week for 6 weeks after that. And you can listen to it wherever you get your podcast, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Amazon, anywhere.
Well, and tell us about any plans for the future. How are you going to grow this podcast?
Unclear. We'll see how many people listen to it.
I love it so much. So how can we learn more? Do you have a website out with information about this?
There's no website, but just look for the term Noble and podcast anywhere you find your podcast, and you'll find it.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Sean, and so good to meet you and hear about your life story starting out in journalism later in life. I can relate to that for sure. So everyone needs to thank you. Check out Sean Raviv, Noble podcast. Anywhere you can stream podcasts, you can listen. Really interesting 8-series podcast about the crime that happened in Noble, Georgia. Hundreds, maybe thousands impacted. Thanks again for coming on, Sean.